Lord has called us to live into this text. And I think particularly in the time and culture that we live, I can't think of a book of the New Testament that is more needed for our time and place in the culture, and our time and place particularly as Anglican Christians in this culture. Christians first, Anglicans second. But as Christian Anglicans in this culture, I should have said. I want to introduce this topic as when we're reading 1 Corinthians, what we're actually doing is reading someone else's mail. Okay? Have you ever had this happen to you where you accidentally read a piece of mail that was not meant for you to read? It was not meant for your eyes to behold. When I was a graduate student at Florida State University, my name is David, and there is a professor named David as well at that university. And I went to check, I had a mailbox, he had a mailbox. I went to check my mail, and there was a very harsh letter from the chair of the department ripping me every which way from sundown to sunup in this letter. And it wasn't until I got about 3/4 of the way through the letter that I realized it was not meant for me. So I put it in the other person's box and walked away and acted like nothing had happened. And so what we're actually doing tonight as we start this journey through 1 Corinthians is we're actually reading a letter that was meant for a specific community at a specific time and a specific place. Now that's a strange thing to do, right? That's a strange thing to do, to read somebody else's mail. But at the same time, the church was guided by the Holy Spirit to include this letter, not just as a general letter to include in the Scriptures, but as a letter that would be God's word written to the church in all places and in all times. They said that these instructions that were given at this specific time in this specific place weren't just meant for that community. They were meant for all Christians everywhere at all times. And so if we're going to do the hard work of discerning, okay, how do we figure out this letter that's written to this one specific audience? How do we figure out how that applies to us today? Then we have to do some detective work. We have to do some discernment work of figuring out, okay, what parts of this culture that's being addressed connect with our culture today, right? And if we can see those connections, then we can better understand how to apply this letter in our lives. So what I want to do tonight is very simple. I want to give some background on 1 Corinthians. We're going to do some historical context, some of the background, what's going on. We're going to talk about the city of Corinth, what was happening in that culture, and see some similarities, perhaps, with our own culture. Then we're going to talk about the church in Corinth. We're going to talk about what that Christian community looked like that existed in Corinth, the church in Corinth, and see maybe some connections with our own church community, the Christian church here in Thomasville. And then lastly, we're going to look at the letter to the church in Corinth, and we're going to just look at the introduction tonight as we start to unpack this letter for our life together as a Christian community. So a little background on 1 Corinthians, the city, the church, and the correspondence that we're looking at. Well, first, the city of Corinth. The city of Corinth was a key city in the ancient world because it was at a crossroads. So I want to show you a map here. And on the map, you can see where Corinth is located. It's kind of this little isthmus that connects these two land masses. And so when they were shipping things between these two seas, the fastest way was actually to go overland through Corinth. So they actually had all these rollers for ships. So ships could pull in, they'd put them on rollers, roll them to the other sea, and then they'd carry on about their way. And any city that has that much trade going through that, you would expect to be incredibly diverse. It connected the two halves of the Mediterranean world. And so it was a crossroads for trade. And also, as you know, any city that is a crossroads for trade not only is diverse, but it has a lot of money, right? There's lots of money to be made in trade. And so Corinth had a lot of money, the city of Corinth. So it was an ancient Greek powerhouse city during the rise of Athens in the 5th century BC. and it has this incredible reputation. It was sort of second only to Athens in power and wealth. But it was destroyed by Romans as they swept through Greece in the 2nd century BC. However, because of its location and this key location on a trade route, it gets refounded by Julius Caesar. You may have heard of him at one time or another, in 44 BC. So what that means is the city of Corinth that Paul is addressing was only founded about 100 years before he founded the Christian church there. So it had only been refounded as a city. People had only been living there for about 100 years. The first settlers that settled this new Roman colony in 44 BC were Roman freedmen. Okay, Roman freedmen. Roman freedmen were people who had perhaps gotten into debt, right? Had been living above their means. And so the only way to get out of debt in the ancient world was you could go to prison for a very long time until you could pay the debt, or you could sell yourself into slavery. Okay? And then but slavery was a little different in the ancient world. Once you had worked for a certain number of years, you could earn your freedom back. You had paid off your debt, and you could be free again. And so these freedmen would have been those types, debtor slaves that had worked off their debts and were now free. But in the process of working off their debts, they'd lost their land. So they had no land to call their own. And then the other type were criminals. Criminals who had been set free because they'd paid their time and done paid their dues for whatever criminal offenses they committed. Do you guys know of a colony that was made up of people who needed land and that used to be criminals? Does anybody know a colony like that? Georgia? Georgia? Did I hear Georgia? Yeah. Australia, that's correct. Yeah. I was thinking of Australia, actually. Yeah, that's right. The city of Corinth... Georgia! Yes, there we go. Very good. Corinth also always had a reputation for sexual vice. So there's this Greek word, Korinthiazo, which means to act like a Corinthian. So going all the way back to the 5th century BC, this term was used widely in the Greek-speaking world to mean to commit fornication, right? Sexual, to be kind of sexually active outside of a marriage. And so Korinthiazo, so they had this reputation. And one thing we know is from archaeology was that the population was, because of this reputation, ravaged by disease. And we happen to know what kind of disease because they made votive offerings in the shape of the body part they wanted to heal. I won't say more than that in a church setting, but that is to say that they were ravaged by disease because there was so much sexual activity happening between people. And so that's something we know from the archaeological record. Religions in Corinth. They had the Roman-Greek pantheon. So the Romans, when they conquered, whenever they'd come across a new city-state that had their own special god, they'd say, bring them on, we'll just incorporate them. And they spread across the Mediterranean. And so they had thousands of gods that they worshipped in the Roman and Greek world. And so what we'll find is many of the Christians had formerly been worshiping all these different Roman and Greek gods. They also, because of their critical place on this trade route, had a lot of mystery cults out of the eastern side. So much of the religion they had came from the west. And then they also had these mystery cults, which these mystery cults had sort of heavy emphasis on spiritualism, spiritual experience, and wisdom. That you could enlighten your mind and sort of get to this higher level of existence where you had a higher level of understanding, where you grasped Sophia, wisdom. Okay, so those were the two primary religious spheres in Corinth. And then there were some Jews, a very, very small population of Jews. The archaeologists just recently, I think just about not that recent, I guess 10 years ago, they discovered the lintel on the Jewish synagogue that was in Corinth. They had the little doorpost where they labeled it, this is the synagogue of the Jews. There was probably only one synagogue for the whole city of Corinth because the population was very small. Socioeconomically, as with any trade route, there were some very, very wealthy people, but they were supported by a large group of working poor, which included slaves. There was a need for manual labor to haul these ships over the isthmus to transport them from one city to the next. There was all these craftsmen, so lots of working poor and some very, very, very wealthy folks as well. Gordon Fee puts it like this. Paul's Corinth was at once the New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas of the ancient world. So if you can combine all three of those cities in your mind somehow, that's what Corinth was like. Maybe we could throw Atlanta in there somewhere. I don't know where Atlanta fits in, but the church in Corinth. So that's what the city was like. The church in Corinth was founded by the Apostle Paul, and I want to read this out loud to you. This is from Acts 18, and this tells the account of Paul founding the church. So let me read this to you. This is Acts chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, Paul was a tent maker, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. I guess I could have kept reading on. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. So let me just summarize what we just read. So Paul, when he first gets into town, immediately goes to the Jewish synagogue. Paul was Jewish, and he starts preaching about the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, that he's come. The Jews are not very receptive to his message. So finally he gets fed up and he says, well, forget it, I'm going to the Gentiles. And he goes to the Gentiles and suddenly starts having all these conversions. And so the Corinthian church is starting to be found. He starts baptizing people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and starting the church. So verse 9, "And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, 'Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people.' And Paul stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them." So Paul stays with them for 1.5 years, and then when we go on to read, he's deciding he's going to leave because he's brought up on all these charges, and he ends up staying for longer because the charges are dismissed by this guy Gallio, who is the proconsul, who's like the governor of that region. And so the charges get dismissed by Gallio. So we know actually exactly when the church was founded. So a lot of times we don't know when these Christian communities popped up and how they popped up. But in this case, we actually know the exact date when this happened. So we know that the church was founded sometime between 50 and 52 AD. Because that's when Gallio was the proconsul, and also when Claudius was the emperor. So we can figure out that overlap of those 3 years. Somewhere in that three-year period, that's when Paul traveled to Corinth and did his work there. So we know right when Paul did this. We also know some of what the church consisted of. So we know, for example, from Acts 18, there was mostly Gentile, non-Jews who converted. So these would have been former pagans who worshipped the Roman and Greek gods, or maybe were part of a mystery cult, who converted to Christianity. We know that, but there were some Jews, and he acknowledges some of those in Acts 18. We also know from the letter itself that the church in Corinth was mostly poor, with some very wealthy members. Okay, so most of the congregation was poor, but they did have some wealthy members. Oh, sorry. Come on. There's Gordon Fee. So Gordon Fee again summarizes it. The church was in many ways a mirror of the city. So if you took a cross-section of Corinth, it would look very similar to the congregation that Paul founded in Corinth. They would have come, some from the Jewish background, some from mystery cults, some from the Roman Greek pantheon. They would have been a few wealthy people, a lot of poor people, working poor. It looked a lot like the city of Corinth itself. So that's what the church looked like. The letter to Corinth. So let's look at the letter itself. I want to start by reading just the first verse of 1 Corinthians. And this is where we got the title for our series. We're gonna dig into this passage a little bit. Paul, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes, to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints together, with all those who in every place call upon the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, both their Lord and ours. So I want to note something very interesting about the way that Paul addresses them. He says, to the church of God that is in Corinth. Note that Paul is calling them to be the church of God in Corinth and not the Corinthian church. Right? What is their primary identity that Paul is highlighting? That their first identity, their primary identity is in the church of God. And where do you happen to be? In Corinth. So you could be in the church of God and be in Rome. You could be the church of God and be in Athens. You could be the church of God and be in Thomasville. You could be the church of God and be in Las Vegas, right? In all of these places, the primary identification is the church of God in a particular place, not a Corinthian church. And the central problem that the letter is going to be addressing is that they see themselves first and foremost as Corinthians, not as Christians. Their first identity, their first allegiance is to their identity as a Corinthian, not as a Christian. And so, again, Gordon Fee writes this. Although they were the Christian church in Corinth, an inordinate amount of Corinth was yet in them, emerging in a number of attitudes and behaviors that required radical surgery without killing the patient. That's always key if you're doing surgery, right? You don't want to kill the patient. And so that's, if you get nothing out of anything else I say tonight, get that the central problem he's addressing is that these people were more Corinthian than they were Christian. There we go. So first is third. So the name of our text is a little misleading because we call it 1 Corinthians. But this is actually Paul's third letter to them. Okay? So, or the third in their communication. So in 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul refers to his first letter that he sent them. And then in 1 Corinthians 7:1, we hear about a letter from the Corinthians to him, right, that he's responding to. And so this is the third letter in a series of exchanges between this community and their founder, Paul. And so that's important because we're not only reading someone else's mail, we're reading someone else's mail in the middle of a conversation that's been ongoing before. And so at times we're going to have to try to figure out, okay, what were they talking about before? Because we're stepping into this conversation midway. And as we go through the series, I'll try to make that clear for you. The second thing we need to note about this letter is we know when it was written. So we know that he wrote this in the springtime of 53 to 55 AD. And we know that from 1 Corinthians 16:8, where Paul writes this. But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. Okay? So we know when Pentecost takes place. in the springtime, and so we know that he's writing this just before Pentecost, actually in the beginning of summer, really. So we know that this is sometime between Easter and Pentecost that Paul is writing this letter. And we also know that it's about 2 or 3 years after he's left them. So in 3 years, they've sort of fallen apart without their leader. The location, again, as I read in that verse, is in Ephesus. That's where Paul's writing from. And so now I want to actually, we're going to dig into this. I think we gave out all the passages, didn't we? Do we have any extra ones? I don't think so. That's okay. I don't need one. So does anybody need more? Do we need to make more copies? Does everybody have one? Good. Okay, so we're going to actually look at this introduction together. And I want to ask a question of you all as we begin to start to look at it. And it's a question that we should ask of any letter that we read. The fancy word for this, I'm going to teach you a fancy biblical term that we use in the academy, okay? So you're getting some inside lingo. It's called the occasion of the letter, okay? The occasion, which means basically, why was Paul writing this letter? Why was Paul writing this letter? And we get some really strong clues in the introduction. So I want to look at the introduction with you. But first, I want to explain a little bit about the way that Paul's writing, because I think to us, when we write a letter, we usually don't start with ourselves, right? How do we write letters when we're writing a letter? Dear so-and-so, right? Comma, and then you go on. Where is your name? At the bottom, right? In the ancient world, it was the exact opposite. You started with yourself because you're awesome. No, I'm just kidding. That's not why. No, because you wanted to identify that who you were so that they would read your letter, right? So they'd know who is addressing them. And so there's always the same pattern. In all ancient letters, they always start with what's called a salutation, which starts with the name of the author, and then who they're addressing, who they're writing to, and then some generic greetings that they would give them. So, and then what follows after that in all ancient letters was some sort of thanksgiving. So you'd offer some prayer to the gods, giving thanks for that person. If you're a Christian, you wouldn't do that to the gods. You do that to God, to the one God. And so you would always start letters by praying for the person that you were addressing. So wouldn't that be a cool thing to bring back? That every time you wrote somebody a letter, you would write like a little prayer, the way that you're praying for them. Yeah. You guys know the plus sign I put after my name sometimes? Do you know why I do that? It means that I prayed God's blessing on whoever's receiving that letter. So every time I hit a plus sign, I'm praying for you all. That's what I'm doing. That's why we do it. It's a sign that I'm praying God's blessing over you. It's not that I'm ordained. That's not what that means. Just to be clear.
But we're not supposed to do it.
Yeah, it would get confusing because usually it's only priests that do it. So, but unless you're fearing, you know what's awesome though? Do you guys remember Google Plus? Do you guys remember? Does Google Plus still exist? Does it? Okay. So when Google Plus came out, they put a plus sign in front of everybody's name, which is what bishops usually do. So everybody was a bishop in Google Plus world. Anyways, so sorry, that was completely tangential. Has nothing to do with 1 Corinthians. But we get some real clues just in the way that Paul opens his letter. Because Paul uses the salutation and the thanksgiving to start laying out the themes of the entire letter. Okay? So does everybody have their detective hats on? Sherlock Holmes? Double brim? All right. Here's what I want you to do. In your tables or clusters, wherever they may be, you have the passage. I want you to figure out what are some of the themes that you can tell that Paul is going to be addressing in this letter. What are some things that he seems to be emphasizing? And just to remind you, the salutation normally would just be, I, Paul, and then to whoever it is. So anything that's not a name is something that Paul is adding on extra that's unique to Paul. And in the Thanksgiving, that tells you a little bit about what he's praying for them as they start to approach his letter. So we're just going to look at those first 9 verses for right now. Just the first 9 verses. And tell me what some of the themes are. Take a couple minutes to go through it on your own. and then discuss it in your tables, and we'll come back together as a group, okay?